Hello everyone, welcome back. This week we are going to be talking about intimate partner violence. You've also heard this called domestic violence. However, we have updated terminology and we now call this intimate partner violence. So as always, there may be some triggering topics that we talk about in this section. If you need to take a break, always feel free to take a break and then come back and finish as you need. I will also encourage you to take notes as you go, just like you would if you were in a classroom setting. Yeah, just take care of yourself. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So when we talk about intimate partner violence, what are we really talking about? Well, intimate partner violence is defined as any behavior within an intimate relationship that causes physical, psychological, or sexual harm. So we've updated the lingo with intimate partner violence. It used to be called domestic violence, and domestic violence had the connotations and statutorial definitions that you could only have this type of interaction or this type of charge if you were married and it was between a man and a woman. So with further research and further recognition, we have changed our outcomes and really our viewpoints on violence in interpersonal relationships. And so we now call it intimate partner violence, and this definition was created to encompass those relationships that are same-sex relationships, may not be married, they may be domestic partnerships, they could be in the dating relationship, all of that. So parent-child relationship, child-parent relationships, things like that. So IPV, intimate partner violence, that's the acronym for it. IPV includes physical aggression, psychological abuse, forced sexual intercourse, isolation, stalking or monitoring someone's movements, and restricting access to information or assistance. So all of these encompass intimate partner violence. Let's look at these a little bit further. Look first at the physical violence behaviors. These are behaviors that are exactly what you think they are. It could include hitting, punching, shoving, biting, throwing items, restraining a partner, throwing people up against walls, all of that. When we think of IPV, we really think of the physical violence aspect. The partner who is the victim shows up with bruises, maybe a black eye, maybe a busted lip, things like that. However, not all intimate partner violence is physical violence. There are other aspects of IPV that are non-physical. Sexual violence includes forced sexual acts. There's no other word to say other than rape. It's essentially rape. So we talked about marital rape and how marital rape was banned essentially in the 90s here in the United States. But we still see forced sexual acts within intimate partner settings that the victim may not recognize as rape. So I've worked cases in child welfare where dad held mom down and forced her into sexual intercourse on several occasions. She did not want to have sexual intercourse, but he made her. Essentially, she was raped, but she didn't recognize that she was raped. So you've heard me talk about domestic violence, just like we talked about with rape. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence, is all about power and control. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I believe, on the next slide. No, I think it's on the next slide. Hang on. No, we'll talk about that here in a little bit in this presentation. But essentially, partner who is the offender seeks to control the behaviors in all aspects of the victim partner in the relationship. And while we typically think of intimate partner violence being physical abuse, emotional abuse, it's also economic like abuse. And I have seen so many economic issues in my time, and a lot of people ask people, well, why don't you just leave? Like after the first incident, why don't you just leave? We'll talk about the cycle of violence here in a minute. However, it's on average, it takes about 7 instances before the victim finally realizes they need to get out of that relationship. And a lot of it has to do with the isolation and the economic dependence. So economic control behaviors essentially are that the offending spouse really is the primary breadwinner and maybe the only breadwinner in the family. So the victim, I'm going to use mom because primarily women are the victims of intimate partner violence. They are the majority of victims, and their male partners are the majority of offenders. So essentially, dad is the one that's working. He's abusive to mom, but mom is fully financially dependent on dad. She may have never had a job. She may not know how to get a job. He may have emotionally abused her and broken her down so much that she doesn't think she's worthy of getting a job. And so economic control is a huge factor with intimate partner violence. Emotional violence is something that we see all too common with these relationships. And this includes name calling, criticizing, humiliating, all of that. You will see that the offender, in an effort to be in control, will make the victim feel as they need that offender. They've isolated them mostly from their family and friends and any social networks. The victims typically don't have a social network outside of the offender. And so it creates this learned helplessness, essentially, which we'll talk about. All right, so now that we've kind of looked at the different types of abuse that goes on within the intimate relationship, let's turn our attention to looking at really the scope of the problem. So intimate partner violence is an all too common occurrence, really. You can see here that it accounted for nearly 1/4 of all violent crimes against women, and about 5%, 4%, 5% of violent crimes against men in the early 2000s. But what's even more staggering is who's there during the domestic violence episode. Well, children are the unknown victims if they're not the primary victim. They typically are secondary victims of the intimate partner violence. In fact, a study kind of showed that children were present in about 38% of incidents that involved female victims and about 21% of incidents that involved male victims. So children being in the household is an all too common thing. And in fact, in the state of Georgia, it got changed probably about a year or two ago. But there used to be a code in the child abuse section that allowed for child abuse investigators to substantiate a case of child abuse against the perpetrator of intimate partner violence if a child was there and witnessed it. So it's become a problem, especially with with children and developmentally with children, that child welfare has also taken notice of needing to intervene in these type of situations. So I want to kind of bring us back. We've talked about the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment before, but I wanted to bring it back to your attention. Remember that the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment occurred in the 80s and essentially tested for the effectiveness of arrest during these episodes of domestic violence. The study essentially kind of looked at various police responses and ultimately found that mandatory arrest, or every time the offender was arrested, they were less likely to have subsequent arrest for the same offense of domestic violence back then. But remember that one of the cautions that came out of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment was that we should not create mandatory laws because that study had not been replicated. And further replications of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment yielded mixed results around arrest policies. However, we as a nation decided to take, the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment's results and run with it. So essentially, because policymakers saw that really mandatory arrest reduced subsequent arrest by half, that they would incorporate a mandatory arrest policy pretty much nationwide. And so the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment really created the mandatory arrest policies that we still see today. And I think it was back in week 4 or 5, I gave you a list of all of the mandatory arrest policies throughout the nation, kind of what state does what. Refer back to that just to kind of see what your state does, see what Georgia does. Remember, arrest can be discretionary, highly encouraged, or mandatory. And so we typically see that most arrest policies in the United States, when it comes to intimate partner violence, are highly encouraged or mandatory. We see that we have had a lot of kind of responses to intimate partner violence over the last several decades, really. I feel old saying that, but it really has been decades. And we see that we have those mandatory arrests and charging of offenders in IPV situations that came out of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. But we also see the increased use of protection orders or restraining orders. In Georgia, we call them temporary protective orders or TPOs. And essentially those allow the victim to have a court order that mandates that the offender not be around them or their children, things like that. We also have seen some bans on having weapons, perpetrators having weapons. Now that's highly controversial, along with all Second Amendment restrictions. However, we do see that some states have laws on the books that allow the state to intervene and take weapons of those people who are perpetrators of intimate partner violence. You will see why that is so important in a little bit, but I will give you kind of a preview. If a perpetrator of intimate partner violence has access to a weapon, that incident is at high likelihood to become a homicide. And so it's important to limit the access that offenders have, and especially repeat offenders. You will notice that a lot of relationships that have intimate partner violence, it's not just like a one and done. You typically see a lot of episodes within that relationship. And then there are also mandatory reporting guidelines to child welfare when children are involved. So we call those CPS referrals, and we'll talk about CPS when we talk about child welfare and child abuse in a couple of weeks. But essentially, law enforcement makes a report to the local Family and Children's Services for them to investigate to see if they need to be involved in giving the family services and things like that. A lot of my cases that I worked when I was in child welfare and investigated as a child abuse investigator involved intimate partner violence. I've seen a lot. In fact, I had one case where the child who was about 12 jumped on his father's back while his father was holding a gun to his mother's head. And so that raises a lot of concern around, the child's safety and the mother's safety. And that was a really bad case where mom had been extremely beaten and abused by her husband. And I had to be the one that kind of separated them and made him leave. Law enforcement was with me and all of that, but it was really kind of scary where you see older children actually get physically involved in trying to protect their mothers or fathers in some cases, and that causes them to maybe get hurt as well. So those are some of our legal responses. Now I want to try to help you answer the question of why do people stay in these relationships? So scholars have developed something called the cycle of violence to help us explain why people and victims stay in relationships that have violence in them. If I had to tell you, this is probably one of the most important slides that you will see in this presentation, because this truly helps us understand the dynamics of these relationships. And so I want you to kind of think of this as an ongoing cycle, because it is. We can skip through some of these, but you typically have these three main parts of the cycle. And there's not typically like a start to it. If I had to put a start to it, I would say it's probably going to be the honeymoon phase. So you can see my pointer here. The honeymoon phase is essentially, it means different things at different points in the cycle. So essentially the honeymoon phase is when the partners first get together. Everything is perfectly fine. It's loving, it's caring. The future perpetrator may start bringing flowers and may just kind of shower the future victim with gifts, and things are good. But there are small cracks that seem to start showing. And so in the honeymoon phase, you start to see what's known as the tension building phase also start overlapping. So there may be small remarks like, if they go out to eat and you start seeing the potential abuser start the emotional abuse around food. So like, honey, do you really need that extra plate of food? Or, honey, I think you're good. Clothing's starting to get a little tight. So you start to see those psychological aspects creeping in. And so this tension building phase can build for a while. And so in the tension building phase, you start to see threats, verbal, psychological abuse, intimidation starting to occur. You start to see further isolation happening, where the offender may be like, well, I really want to know where you're going, or start put this tracking on your phone so I can see where you're at all times. And then when you're staying out too late, he starts to get mad and then starts to restrict your access to friends and things. And so you see that tension kind of building up. Ultimately, that tension building phase is going to result in what we call the explosion phase. And the explosion phase is where the battering happens. So the explosion phase is essentially where the abusive incident happens, whether it be him hitting his partner, him throwing something against the wall, on emotional abuse, things like that. So like if you had a situation where a guy made his girlfriend quit her job to stay at home, you will start to see in between, that's still considered part of the tension building phase. And then when she goes out with a friend, he may come home and beat her because she wasn't there when he got home. So after the explosion phase, you always see this honeymoon phase again. So after he beats her, the next morning, he may fix her breakfast and apologize profusely. Say, I was drinking a lot. I did not mean that. I'm so sorry. I'll never do that again. You'll see promises like, I promise you it will get better. I need such and such. Or he may blame the victim further in the relationship. As the victim is beaten down, you will see more blame being put on the victim. If you would just have dinner ready whenever I got home, that would never happen again. Things like that. And so after the honeymoon phase, you still see this tension building phase again. So this is a vicious cycle that goes round and round. And this cycle has been empirically proven to truly explain why people stay. And a lot of people say that, the honeymoon phase is just so good. When it is good, it is good. But when it is bad, it is bad. I've heard that so many times in my professional career. And I just wondered, why can't you see what we all see? But essentially, the victim's psychological mentality has been broken. And no one's there to pick up the pieces and rebuild it, because they typically have been isolated from any positive social situations. So the cycle of violence is very important for you to know, just because we see these phases within IPV relationships that go on and on and on through this circle, or through this cycle. And each of these stages will occur. And I will say, through tension building, there may be a honeymoon phase that creeps in right here, where tensions are high, but the honeymoon phase happens, and then it goes back to the tension building again. So honeymoon phase may last for a day or two, and then tensions start to build, and then the explosive phase, or the actual abuse, happens. We see that a lot too. Some lasting psychological effects on victims of intimate partner violence that you need to be aware of. I'm sure you all have heard of battered women's syndrome. If you haven't, you'll read about it. But essentially, battered women's syndrome is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder that deals exclusively with the effects of being battered and being a victim of intimate partner violence. Battered women's syndrome is a legal defense as well. And I'm not going to go directly into the legal defense of battered women's syndrome, but it is a legal defense. But essentially, that cycle of violence that we just went over changes the psychological makeup. And so, because battered women's syndrome essentially says that a woman who is subjugated to intimate partner violence over a long period of time will essentially snap and have enough. And when they have snapped, that is when they fight back, and they most likely will kill their partner in the heat of battle. The controversy with battered women syndrome is when certain premeditations happen. So if a an offender is not actively battering, but is killed, and then the defense of battered women syndrome is used, there's some controversy there around, was it truly self-defense? Because battered women syndrome essentially is seen as a self-defense defense tactic. Another effect that we see is learned helplessness. And it's essentially, we see that the victim, having endured intimate partner violence for so long, accepts the abuse as the way of life. And they have an inability to see a life outside of it. And so this learned helplessness really kind of explains why victims don't recognize themselves as victims. A lot of research has shown that children who witness domestic violence in their home or intimate partner violence will also either be victims or perpetrators of future violence in their relationships. So we see this generational pattern of intimate partner violence within the relationship that's kind of learned. And so learned helplessness essentially says that I've learned that this is just the way families operate. We also see post-traumatic stress disorder within these relationships, and something that is called tonic immobility. And this is an important concept because during the battering phase, tonic immobility may occur. So this is a state of involuntary paralysis in which an individual cannot move and in a number of cases cannot speak. You see tonic immobility in rape cases as well, but you do see these in intimate partner violence cases where the tension building phase happens and the snap happens and the battering happens. And in the moment of the battering, the victim may just go immobile and can't really function while being battered, so they can't fight back and things like that. It is important to note that intimate partner violence doesn't just happen in heterosexual relationships. In fact, intimate partner violence is actually higher in the LGBTQ plus community. IPV occurs in about 21 to 50% of male same-sex couples and is even higher in lesbian couples. There are extenuating circumstances with victims in these situations reporting because they may already be isolated from everyone. And so that isolation component that you see in the cycle of violence may be like non-existent because they're already isolated. But another factor is the leverage that the abusing partner has to potentially out their victim partner. So we know that a lot of same-sex couples or same-sex or homosexual individuals may not be out fully open about their sexuality. And so we see a lot of partners that are perpetrators of IPV using that to their advantage. And so they kind of are blackmailed into staying into the relationship. We also see some legal barriers. So police may not really recognize homosexual couples as having intimate partner violence. That has changed a lot, especially with the lingo that is used in like intimate partner violence instead of domestic violence and some of the law changes. But we all know people have their certain beliefs, and so police may be less likely to intervene and charge if they don't believe in those type of relationships. There are also some legal barriers. Same-sex partners in some states can't get protection orders, and they also can be precluded from domestic violence shelters. We'll talk about shelters here in a minute, but a lot of shelters are built exclusively for women and children. And so victims of same-sex relationships may not really have a quote-unquote safe place to go because there's not as many services for LGBTQ plus individuals, especially homosexual men who are victims of IPV. There are not exclusive like LGBTQ plus shelters around the United States. So we talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to go again. Hang on one second. Sorry, writing down timestamps for you. There are significant developmental issues to children who grow up in homes with domestic violence. There's a significant overlap in the data around intimate partner violence and child abuse. The higher violence that is tolerated in the home, the more likely abuse is happening. But children are especially susceptible to behavioral changes and psychological changes because they're still developing. And so we see a lot of children demonstrate certain types of behavior when they've been exposed to intimate partner violence. So we see more likely to have depression, anxiety, social withdrawals, hyperactivity and aggression. We see problems integrating. They may be more violent or more prone to use violence because they're seeing violence. School tends to suffer. School performance tends to suffer. And we see a lot of self-esteem issues happening with children who witness intimate partner violence. So we have looked at some of the effects of intimate partner violence. We've talked about the cycle of violence. Now let's turn our attention to batterers themselves. There are three main typologies of batterers that you have on your screen. This table is very good. It's from your book, it's table 9.5, but it really kind of summarizes the characteristics very well. So the first typology that you have is the family-only typology, and let me get my pointer. So the family-only typology. This typology has the lowest levels of psychological and sexual abuse and the least amount of violence is shown outside of the home. This family-only typology batterer really is a person who lets stress build up, and so the violence results from a combination of stress and certain risk factors. So if they grew up in a home that they witnessed domestic violence and they can't really deal with stress very well, they may turn to violent episodes. This type of batterer is the least likely to have hostility toward women. So that is something to remember. The family-only typology batterer, the family-only batterer is the least likely to have generalized hostility toward women. They are least likely to escalate violence to the dysphoric borderline batterer. This is a moderate batterer. Not so much violence outside of the home, to keep it more in, but you start to see the psychological issues that come with the dysphoric borderline. This person will have a background of parental abuse and rejection, and typically the fear of rejection, has intense jealousy, emotional instability, and unstable personal relationships. This person is where you're starting to see the control aspect happen. The borderline batterer is the one that has to control because they have that fear of rejection and jealousy. Then you have the antisocial batterer, or the generally violent. We call them the antisocial batterer. This batterer shows severe levels of violence, high levels of extrafamilial violence as well. So they are just a violent individual. Violence is their first coping strategy that they turn to. They are the most likely to exhibit criminal behavior, have arrest and substance abuse issues. They are the highest levels of witnessing previous family violence. This is that generational family violence. And marital violence is a part of the general use of aggression. So you see the power and the control aspect in the antisocial batterer. This person utilizes violence in everyday coping mechanisms. So I'm sure that you can turn on the news or read the newspapers or read articles. I know a lot of you don't like to watch the news or stay updated on stuff like that, but I'm sure you've seen some type of news around domestic violence, intimate partner violence turning to murder, to homicide. Those are extreme circumstances, but again, if you look at that cycle of violence that we went over, you start seeing that cycle go over and over and over again, and that tension building phase gets more intense, more intense. There are certain aspects or certain risk factors that have been shown to increase the likelihood of homicide within the context of intimate partner violence. So education levels and drug use are some of the major predictors, especially drug use. But access to firearms, if they have access to a firearm that's readily available when they go into the explosion stage, that increases tremendously the likelihood of homicidal violence. Having a stepchild in the home increases the likelihood of homicide in this. And in fact, having a stepchild in the home increases the likelihood of domestic violence all around. Again, it goes to the power and control aspect, remember? If the batterer feels like they cannot control the child, or that the victim is not controlling the child as they think they should, that can be a part of that tension building that essentially leads to an explosion stage. And finally, use of a weapon before. in a before explosion stage. So if someone has been threatened multiple times with a gun, they are more likely to have that gun be used in one of the explosion stages. All right, let's start wrapping up our conversation. And let's talk about some of the interventions that we have put in place for intimate partner violence. There are three main types of programs that we use in the United States for victims and perpetrators of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So there are programs for child witnesses. These programs are aimed at preventing future harm. So they're preventative programs. These programs also help the child witnesses kind of decompress and help them learn appropriate relationship boundaries. Then we also have programs for victims of violence. These are aimed at providing emergency assistance and increasing available choices. We have one here in Statesboro, Nikki's Place, that I have put in folio this week that you can kind of check out. But these programs help the victims be safe, start having a social community, and train them in any thing they really need, whether it be job training, employment training, house hunting, things like that. And then finally, there are programs available for batterers. So we recognize that intimate partner violence, in order to truly prevent intimate partner violence, you can't just focus programming on victims. You also have to focus programming on batterers. And so there are several programs that are batterer-specific programs that essentially are used to help them change their behaviors and change their cognitive abilities and thoughts around power and control. So we're going to talk a little bit about these more in depth. So let's look at the victims first. So there are shelters, hotlines, relocation services. A lot of you found a lot of services tailored to victims. Mental health services are available in a lot of these shelters. They kind of group therapy is a big part of the service array with intimate partner violence victims, because it helps them build a social network of people who can relate to what they have gone through and help them kind of be accountable. Treatment is really targeted at enhancing their self-esteem, changing their attitudes and behaviors, normalizing their experiences, and kind of helping them get back on their feet. Remember, financial control may have been an issue, so this kind of helps them get job-ready skills and kind of teaches them how to function in the world that they may, so they don't have to be dependent on someone to meet their needs. Then we have interventions for children. So you have crisis interventions, and remember, shelters are typically for women and children, so they have access to shelters. But you then also have plans that you develop. These shelters help women and children develop what are known as safety plans. And so that helps them kind of think about, how do I get out of this situation? What do I do if this situation happens? Things like that. There are mental health services that are available that are geared toward the child's developmental stage that kind of teaches them normal relationship boundaries, normal relationship patterns, kind of helps them deal with what they have seen and kind of helps them realize the normalcy of what normal relationships should look like. And then there are parent-child groups. So there is also groups to where parents and the child together can have sessions that help them grow their bonds and kind of teaches the parents how to do positive behavior or positive parenting, things like that. And finally, there are interventions for offenders. Now, having worked in probation and child welfare, I can tell you that everyone thinks that the offender should go to anger management. And that is the number one place. It used to drive me crazy when we had domestic violence cases, because the number one service that case managers would put for most of the fathers who, because the fathers were perpetrators, was you're going to go to anger management. Folks, anger management doesn't work in these situations. Why? Because domestic violence or intimate partner violence is not about anger. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence is about power and control. If you send an offender to anger management and they do not have an anger issue as their main issue, they're not going to get anything out of that service. They're going to check the boxes that they did that service and be done. True intervention programming for offenders deal with the power and control aspect and teaches the offenders how to deal with their need to be controlling and have power dynamics. It teaches them to break down what generation of observations within their own families have taught them. They do that through a cognitive behavioral approach. They also do psychoeducational approaches. Where I came from, up north in the Conasauga Judicial Circuit, we had a 24-week program that offenders went through. And it was an intensive class that they went together. All the offenders, they did workbooks. They had to do group counseling sessions, individual sessions. It was very intense for them. Another thing is those classes cost money. They're not free. And so the offenders normally have to pay for them. And so there are some controversies around intervention programming to offenders. So one is the economic disparity. And so those programs cost anywhere between like $24 and $50 a session. And each session costs that money that they have to pay. And so we know that sometimes economic issues arise. And so the argument can be made that we are creating undue burdens that will increase potential violence because stress buildup and things like that. There's also this school of thought that by putting offenders together in a group for intervention, we are teaching them more sophisticated modes of control. They are learning from each other. Truly, like cognitive-based therapy and cognitive behavioral approaches, the modality of the therapist is key to kind of getting that under control. because cognitive behavioral therapy essentially changes the way that a person thinks and a way that the person kind of sees the world. And so CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been the gold star modality for offenders. All right, that's going to conclude this week. I hope you all have made it through okay. Like I said, if you need to take breaks during this, please do. Take care of yourself. We're getting into kind of some special populations and very specific types of victimization that can be triggering. So I just want you to make sure you're taking care of yourself. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will talk to you later.